Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. I am your host Baby ARUGULA and thank you for joining me for my first video of 2021. Today I wanted to address a question which was raised within my local community of artists and musicians, and that is, how do I compress the drums? The dynamics of So you want to know how to compress the drums. Compressing the drums is possibly one of the most nuanced and varied parts of any mix. Before we talk about what compressors to use and what settings to put them at, it's important to ask the question, why do I want to reach for a compressor right now? Plus, if your drums are samples or mostly samples, you probably don't need as much compression or compression at all unless it's more of like a stylistic thing. For live acoustic drums, however, which is the focus of this video, I've identified 5 common reasons why you might want to reach for a compressor. Before we get into these 5 common reasons why you might want to apply compression, I want to drill this point into your head first, and that is oftentimes you don't need compression, and it's really important that you A/B your before and after, and you have them level match so you can really tell if what you're doing is improving the sound of the source. And if you can't tell the difference between your A and B with the effect on and off, you should probably take it off. In my experience so far, if you're not obviously helping, you're probably hurting. And if you can't tell the difference, then it's not going to hurt to take it off and just do less processing. We'll do a video on philosophy someday, but I want you to understand that just because I'm applying these techniques in this video for demonstration does not mean that you need to go on all of your projects and apply every single one of these to every single track in your project. So what are these 5 common reasons why you might want to compress the drums? Some of these reasons are more artistic and for enhancement, and other ones are more about diagnosing problems within the performance and trying to control those very specific elements through compression. I'm going to establish the when and whys of each of these cases where you might want compression, and then I'm going to show you the compressors that I would first think to reach for, and I'm going to show you some settings to get you in a rough ballpark for addressing that issue or just for creating that artistic enhancement. And I'll also leave any gear mentioned throughout this video, any plugins mentioned, in the description below. Real quick, before we jump into Logic, I just want to mention that I am wearing a Baby ARUGULA merch t-shirt. If you would like to pick up your own, you can check out the merch hub in the description below. There's 4 or 5 different designs currently available, and you can get this on all sorts of products, not just t-shirts. So if you're enjoying the content and you want to support the channel, please do check the merch hub down below. Thank you. Okay, here we are in Logic. This is a project of a new song that my band has been working on. It's very bare bones. You can see here we've got some MIDI information outlining the melody of the main vocal part. We have a scratch guitar part. We have more MIDI outlining backup vocals. So we're still in a production stage. The only thing that we have recorded permanently are the drums here. And it's not really mixed. We've got, I auditioned a couple different tape machines. Like I've been using this stage to kind of explore some new plugins that I've been experimenting with, but nothing is mixed. We're not even done tracking. So it's just a good opportunity for diving into these 5 reasons that I have prepared for you. So I'm going to give you a listen to this little bit. I'm just going to solo the drums, just give you a listen to this little bit. Okay, so reason number 1 why you might want to reach for a compressor is for drum bus compression. Now, I prefer to work in a more top-down fashion. I know many mixers love to go from a bottom-up direction and they achieve great sounding mixes, so whichever one you want to do is fine, but at some point you're probably going to be applying drum bus compression regardless of how you start. I'm just putting this first because this is usually where I start. When I approach drum bus compression, I like to think of it as adding adhesion and cohesion to the drum kit. Glue is a common descriptor that's thrown around, and I think this is a pretty good word for it, especially if you're close miking the drums. Drum bus compression can help these isolated elements of a kit feel more like they're actually part of the same drum kit and not separate elements recorded separately. Traditionally, a console might have VCA compressors built into it. As you can see here from my template, I am sort of modeling what it would be like to work with an API console. So we've got our audio tracks here with tape, and then they're going in through API 550 EQs, and then we have our drum bus here, and we have the 2500. Now, typically, any plugin that is emulating an analog VCA bus compressor will work for drum bus compression because that is basically what they were built to do. So in this scenario, I am using an API 2500, but others that would get the job done as well would include the Ssl G Comp, this one. There is the Red 3 compressor by Focusrite, and the Lindell 254E, which is a model of the Neve 2254 VCA bus compressor. All of these were built to be bus compressors, and they do a great job of it, and they're going to give you a great sound. Also, if you don't have other plugins and you just have Logic, or maybe you're using Studio One or some other DAW, most DAWs these days come with their own plugins, right? So in Logic, that is the compressor. Here we have Studio VCA. This is their model of the Red 3 compressor from Focusrite. We have Classic VCA. This is a DBX 160, which I'm pretty sure the DBX 160 was never like integrated into a desk. I'm pretty sure it was a VCA compressor that was always a standalone rack unit. If I'm not mistaken, you can correct me in the comments. I don't know for sure. And then the vintage VCA, this is Logic's Ssl G Compressor Emulation. Do these sound like perfect emulations? No. Are these the best sounding compressors out there? Almost certainly no. But if you're on a tight budget and you only have your DAW, it's gonna get the job done, and there's a lot more customization here. So these compressors are actually more flexible than what they're emulated after. If you see here, we've got a lot more controls and functionality out of the Logic Ssl G compressor, although you might miss out on some of the characteristics of the sound itself. So that's bus compression in a nutshell. Some other ones that I would reach for include emulations of the classic Fairchild compressor. This is a wonderful compressor for bus compression. Usually I'll put this on my stereo bus, but I'll also put it on my drum bus because, you know, back in the day, you're lucky if you have one of these in the studio, but now it's a plugin, so why not throw it on the drum bus? Why not throw it on the stereo out? There's also the Townhouse compressor by Brainworx. This is very similar to the Ssl G bus compressor that I just showed you a moment ago. I don't know too much about the history, but I think they just wanted to build a G compressor that could also be rack mount instead of integrated into a desk, but I feel like it does kind of sound different. Not totally sure. Let me know your experiences with this plugin in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. Next is also the Royal compressor. This one's pretty new for me. I haven't used it too much, but I feel like I'm gonna like it on the drum bus. I haven't used it too much, I'm gonna be totally honest. This is modeled after the RS-124, which if you follow Waves plugins, you know they just released their own version of it. I don't have that version. Then sometimes, not always, but sometimes I'll even think about reaching for an LA2A. This is probably my least likely choice for a drum bus compressor, but I have done it before, depending on the style of drums. Probably not going to do it for this song. And then here's another LA2A. I feel like Waves gets enough shout outs already. Everybody knows about Waves. So this is the VLA-2A from Black Rooster Audio. Is it a fantastic sounding compressor? I would say there's probably a reason why everyone uses the CLA-2A by Waves. But there's that for you if you can't afford Waves plugins. The LA2A is also one of the most emulated compressors out there. There's also one that comes stock with Logic, the vintage opto setting, right? So this is kind of going to give you a rough ballpark of the sonic characteristics of an LA2A, except with way more of the functionality. Okay, let's talk about settings. I'm going to go back to the API 2500 here to demonstrate this. Depending on the settings available in the plugin, I'll usually shoot for around 2 to 5 dB of compression with a ratio of about 4 to 1, depending on the genre. Sometimes I'll go even lower. I won't usually go above 4 to 1 for bus compression, but if you feel like you need it for your project, go ahead and try it. I'm just saying what has worked for me in the past. The attack on bus compression is typically going to be slow enough to allow any transients to get through. So depending on the settings available, right? Sometimes you can type in a very specific number, or you can kind of sweep it around. Other times you've got very specific notches, as you do here. You can only go between these specific values, right? So I'll typically on the API, if I want transients, if I want to preserve the transients on something, I'm just going to set it at 30, which is the slowest. The release is really what's going to vary the most between your different uses of compression. Typically, if I know the tempo of the track, I will actually calculate a release time that is relative to the tempo of the track. However, if I don't know what the tempo of the track is, then all you can really do is use your ears and listen to where it sounds best. Generally speaking, faster release times will start to wash out your cymbals, though, so that is something to be mindful of as you sweep it around. Another tip with bus compression is to set up your compressor in dual mono mode. So I'll close this compressor and show you what I'm talking about here. If you go into Dynamics, go up to API 2500, we've got stereo and we've got dual mono, right? Dual mono, what that does is if there's a tom fill on the right side, if you're in stereo, the compressor is going to react to that tom fill on the right side and also compress the left side. But if you go dual mono, those two sides are being compressed separately. So the left side of the image of your drums isn't going to get squashed as a result of something happening on the right side. This can preserve and sometimes even enhance your sense of width. Sometimes you don't need it, but it is a good trick that I've picked up along the way. And also, if you're doing dual mono and you want the same settings, make sure you hit couple. Do that first. There have been so many instances where I think I'm affecting both the left and right side of the compressors, and I'm not. And all of a sudden, my left side is so much louder or quieter than my right side. So hit couple. So let's go ahead and listen to that same drum bit, and I'm just going to set up this bus compressor as I would normally, just so you can get a feel for how to approach it. So what I've done there is I've opened up the attack, and you can tell when I open up the attack, you can feel the hit of the snare. You can feel the transients of the snare and the kick come through a little more clear. And playing around with this detector thrust, which I think is it's not quite like having the high passing the internal sidechain, but it kind of has a similar effect. And as I move this around, you can see on the meter, when it's on loud, it's mostly compressing the high frequencies that we're most sensitive to, and you can see the compressor really reacting to the snare drum. When it's on normal, you can see it really reacting to the kick drum because the low frequency information is where a lot of the energy is. And then medium, for this particular drum bus, medium has a really nice balance of compressing the kick and the snare drum evenly. So I like where it's at on medium. I'll go ahead and demonstrate that again just in case you missed that. We'll start on normal. See how the kick drum is pushing it up almost to -6 sometimes? Now when I switch it to loud, it's jumping up with the snare drum. And on medium, it's hitting pretty consistently around 2 to 3 dB. I like this. I think this sounds pretty good. So now let's go ahead and A/B the whole thing to make sure that we are actually making a difference that we like. A really good tool to have, you don't have to have the same one that I have, but you should definitely have one somewhere, is a VU meter. This is a really valuable tool for measuring if a particular plugin or effect is increasing your volume. And we can diagnose what exactly is changing when I put the compressor on. So because we're compressing, we are bringing the volume down by between 2 to 3 dB on average, right? So we kind of have to bring it up a little bit. 1.5 seemed like a good number. And without it, the snare drum is kind of in the background of the drum image a little bit. But when we do this, the snare kind of pops up. And earlier when I was playing with the release, it's pretty subtle. You know, the hi-hats I have pretty low in the mix. I'm not someone who likes a lot of hi-hat in my mix, but perhaps if we were railing on the cymbals, you know, you might have been able to tell more of a difference by drastically sweeping the release. But I just went ahead and set it to 0.5. That's what I had it on before, and it seems to sound pretty good. Okay, so that is drum bus compression in a nutshell. There is, of course, more to it. So let me know in the comments below what your favorite bus compressors are, techniques that you've learned over the years, and if you're brand new to bus compression, let me know what you're doing to try it out for your first or, you know, several first times. Let's go ahead and move on to reason number 2 why you might want to reach for a compressor. This second reason for compressing drums can drastically impact the feeling of a recording and is super important to get right. Right being a completely subjective term in this context, but I'm talking about compressing the room mics. Compressing the room mics is a classic trick to bring out the sound of the room the drums were recorded in, adding sustain, depth, size, and impact to the drums. However, some rooms don't sound good compressed, and some styles of music don't benefit from heavily compressed room mics. This is a technique that you're going to have to play around with on a case-by-case basis to learn how and when it will help you. My favorite compressors for room compression would include most of the same compressors as the previous technique because VCA compressors are very versatile, but I would also add the 1176 to the list. With the LA2A that I mentioned earlier, this is one of the most emulated plugins out there. Sometimes they don't want to call it the 76, so they'll call it a FET. Any plugin that's emulating a FET style compressor is going to give you a sound kind of like this, and it is great for destroying room mics. There's also the VLA-FET from Black Rooster Audio, and what I like about this one is that there's a sidechain high pass filter, and on rooms, the kick drum can be very boomy, and you might not want to be compressing on the kick drum so hard every time. So a sidechain high pass filter built into the compressor is really handy for compressing room mics. Likewise, Logic once again comes with emulations of both the black and blue face 1176 FET compressor. So let's go ahead and try this out and see how it sounds. I am going to use the VLA-FET in this example to show you what happens when you use a high-pass filter on the sidechain. So we recorded this in sort of a garage that had been converted into a studio. The garage has a wall separating it in 2 halves basically, and so one half is a studio and the other half is still a garage for like storage and whatnot. But we'll put a microphone in the garage as like just a weird sort of room mic, and it sounds really cool, but it gets a lot of kick drum. So this is a scenario in which you really do want to use a sidechain high pass filter. You can hear how much the kick drum dominates that balance there. So let's go ahead and dial in some settings. So watch what happens as I roll the high pass filter up with the needle. When it's all the way down and when it's off, you can see the needle jumping with every kick hit. But as I roll it up, you're going to notice that the kick drum slowly balances out with the snare drum. You don't always want that, but sometimes you do want that. So that's something that you have to listen for and decide what works in the context of your mix. And also, mind you, I'm listening to the room soloed. I would never do this in a mix. We would be listening to all the drums and the entire song if it were completely recorded when determining what to do with this. But just for this example, I just want to show you what it's doing to the room. So pretty ridiculous settings going on here, but sometimes on a room mic that can work out really well. It kind of all depends. Let's go ahead and listen to the entire drum bus. Actually, let's go ahead and A/B this first to make sure that we're not adding any level, and then we will listen to all the drums in the context. Another handy thing about the VLA-FET over a typical 1176 emulation is that this one has a mix knob, so we can actually blend these effects if we wanted to. I'm going to leave the mix at 100%, but that is something that we could do. So we could essentially do parallel compression, which we'll get to in a minute, within the same plugin on the same track. One thing that you'll notice that I have chosen to do differently from drum bus compression is the attack. It's kind of deceiving because it's just numbers. It's not actually the time, but 7 is the fastest setting on here. So instead of being a slow compressor that allows the transients to come through and actually enhances the sense of impact in the transients, we're actually crushing the transient. And the reason why I'm doing this on the room is because I want my transient, I want the impact to actually be coming from my close mics. You can see we've got a kick and snare, got a knee, right? So we have these mics that are up close, and that's where I really want the impact of the drummer hitting the drums to come from. My garage track here, this is more for the sense of space and ambience and room. So I don't need all that transients. And so what I'm doing is I'm making more room for the impact and crushing the room to add the size. So this is something, like, I'm deciding this arbitrarily as we listen in solo. This could be totally the wrong move to make, which is why you always do things in context. But I just want you to be able to hear what is happening to the room specifically. Let's go ahead and listen to the entire drum bus, and then we might make some changes. Here's without the room. There you go. You can see I've gone all buttons in. I'm going ham on this room compression here. That's not always the way to go. We could try something a little more subtle, actually, because depending on the genre you're working on, you might not want to do that. If you're working on a fast song, you don't have time in between hits for all that sustained decay, right? And this is a faster song, so actually something not so extreme might be even better. It's something that you really have to play around with and feel for your specific project. So let's dial in a little more modest of a room compression, and then we'll move on. That's level balanced, more or less. Let's go ahead and hear it in the mix. Oh, yeah, I think this is a much better, much more appropriate setting. Let's just A and B it without the room entirely, and then I'll A and B it without the plugin. So hopefully that's an obvious change that you can tell there. Obviously, without the room, the drums are severely lacking energy. But even without the plugin on, you're like, okay, there's room, there's ambience, but it's pretty boring. And then you throw the compressor on, you're like, oh, we're pumping, we're moving. Now, this is kind of an example of what I was saying before about some rooms don't sound great compressed. And these rooms are not treated. They're not designed by professional studio builders. This is literally a garage. So it's not going to sound great. And it really doesn't, but that's also kind of the vibe that we're going for. And so instead of trying to shy away from that, we're really trying to own it. But again, when it comes to stylistic choices, you really just have to listen and do what you think is best, All right, so that is room compression in a nutshell. Those are the tools that I would typically reach for and settings that I would play around with in order to achieve a desired result. Again, not every genre would benefit from this, and some genres need more subtle room compression than others, right? So this is something that you have to take on a case-by-case basis. But let me know how your adventures with room compression go in the comment section below. I'd love to know what compressors you're using and just how it goes for you. Let me know. So let's go ahead and move on to reason number 3. Reason number 3 for why you may want to reach for a compressor to compress your drums is for transient shaping. This third reason I've already sort of alluded to in tips number 1 and 2, and is also related to tips number 4 and 5, which I'll get to in a moment. This is using compression to control the relationship between the transient and the sustain of the drums. For commercially competitive music in pop and rock genres, you'll most often need to use compression to enhance the transients of close mics. More often than not, you might even utilize a transient shaper, which I'm not going to discuss in this video. On the contrary, you can also use compression to clamp down on the attack and diminish it, making room for the transients of other elements. You've already seen this in tip 2, for example. But why and when you want to affect the transients in any particular way depends on the song and play style of the drummer and the arrangement of the song, but it is a common reason to reach for a compressor. For transient shaping, you may find yourself needing a lot of control over the compressor. 1176 emulations can be fantastic for accentuating transients because of their quick attack and release times and very aggressive characteristics, but they can often be too colored or extreme if you're controlling multiple elements individually. If you have any plugins emulating Ssl E and G channel strips, the dynamic sections on those plugins are iconic. If you start playing with the built-in compressor and you have it on the slow attack setting, so you're allowing the transients to come through, you will almost certainly recognize that sound from countless records over the years. And if you are looking for a lot of control, but very transparent control, not a lot of color, not a lot of change to the actual frequency profile, you just want strict manipulation of the transient and sustain, then the R comp, the C1 comp, those are both from Waves. Those are very transparent. And if you're working within Logic, you can use the Platinum Digital Compressor. Both of these are just strictly digital. They're not attempting to impart at least any color. They're just doing the job that they are set forth to do. So those can be great for transparent manipulation of the transients. Generally speaking, the same principles will apply. You're going to want a slower attack if you want to enhance the transient, and you're going to want a faster attack if you're trying to diminish the transient, and you'll adjust the ratio depending on how aggressive you want it to be. Probably 4-to-1 is a safe bet because you probably don't want to be limiting it unless you do. But in that case, you might as well just use a limiter. So typically 4-to-1 is a safe ratio for most things when it comes to drum compression. Release time, again, kind of varies on the tempo of the song or what you're trying to do with the transient. Let's go ahead and experiment with transient shaping on the snare drum here, and I'll show you just how drastically you can actually affect the sound of an individual drum with a compressor. For this example, I'm going to use the Platinum Digital Compressor that comes stock with Logic. Pay attention to what happens with the moment at which the stick hits the snare drum. Pay attention to what happens to that specific moment in sound as I sweep the attack back and forth. Right, so that's essentially what we were doing with the room mics as well, where we were taking away the initial impact of the snare drum to make room for this snare mic, which isn't always necessary. It was just something that I wanted to demonstrate. As I'm sweeping the release knob, pay attention to what happens to the ring, the doom, 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 right? For a simplified description, if the snare drum is crossing the threshold and then it's compressing and it's being turned down, the release knob is how soon after that does it stop compressing and allow the volume to come back up. So if you have a quick release, you're going to really quickly tuck down the impact of the snare drum, although we're actually letting the impact through. So it's going to let the crack come through and then compress and then release, and you're going to be left with this ring that gets brought back up in volume after the compressor releases, right? So listen to what happens to the ring of the snare drum as I move this around, because when we go back here, you'll notice it's compressing the whole time. It never stops compressing. And so the tail of the snare drum never gets brought back up. I hope that's obvious for you. If not, consider headphones or monitors if you're not already listening on those already. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how you can utilize the attack and release times to shape the transients of a very particular element of the drums. You can also use the knee. If we go into the graph mode here, you can see this is a pretty soft compression graph, and as we pull this back, we get much more angular. So that can also play an impact in the transient and the impact and kind of the sharpness of the stick hitting the drum. So go ahead and play around with those if you find that your snare drum feels weak or flabby and you need more crack out of it. Or the kick drum, any drums that you need more attack out of. Compression can be a good way to do that. I would caution you not to go overboard though. And as always, use your ears and A/B compare to make sure you're actually helping the signal. Let's go ahead and jump into reason number 4 why you might want to reach for a compressor. Reason number 4 why you might want to compress your drums is for parallel compression. This is a very common technique as well. Actually, all these are common techniques. That's the whole point, is that they're common reasons why you would compress your drums. You can see here within my drum bus sort of folder, I have all of these buses already laid out with their sends. They're not all being sent anywhere yet, but I have this set up as part of my template because these are things that I know I'm probably going to do depending on what tracks are sent to me. Whatever compressor you're using, you might want to start by finding an aggressive setting that would probably be too much by itself, but still has a good sound, a good edge to it that still fits within this context of like the frequency profile of the song itself. Like you can find some super aggressive, edgy thing, but you still want it to sound good in the context of the song, just probably be too much of what it is. And then because it's its own bus, you can use the fader to blend it in to taste. That's how I would recommend using parallel compression or saturation. One of my favorite benefits of using this technique as well is that you can send whatever close mics you want to affect to that bus. You can get them sounding nice and present and punchy and full without completely destroying your cymbals and your hi-hats and making them super washy and harsh and irritating. So this is a really common technique that is utilized pretty heavily. I use this all the time. So probably the most common use that I make of parallel drum buses is bussing the kick and the snare together and then compressing the living crap out of them. So I'm gonna go ahead and demonstrate that here. This kick and snare is bus 12, and you can see I'm already sending them because that's the first thing that I do almost always. Another great thing to do for parallel buses on drums is parallel saturation, but this is about parallel compression, so I'm not gonna get into that, but you can see here I've actually have a saturator on instead of a compressor, but I'll turn that off for now. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna solo this bus that has the kick and snare being sent to it, and I'll set it to unity gain just so we can hear it better. Right, so that's just, there's a lot of bleed, obviously, but that's our kick and our snare mic being sent to this bus. This can be done to enhance the transients, as I described in the previous tip, without destroying the original source, or you can use parallel bus compression to add particular flavors without coloring the original source. Probably the most popular compressor for parallel compression is an 1176, as mentioned in one of the previous tips. It sounds great. Try making a separate bus with an 1176, all buttons in with the slow attack and the fast release, and then use the volume knob to blend that in, and you will instantly recognize it from so many records. And again, Logic Pro also comes with an 1176 emulation as well. So let's go ahead and open up the CLA-76 and we'll solo it, press play. Listen what happens to the attack on the kick drum. We get so much more attack and presence out of the kick drum. We do lose some of the body, but that's actually okay. This bus here, this parallel compression bus, is not here for the sake of adding body or low end to my kick. This is here to add presence and smack and attack to both the kick and the snare drum. You're going to have phase issues between the original source and the phase that you're blending in. So EQ on parallel compression and parallel saturation buses is actually hugely important, because if you roll off past a certain point, then you're not going to have those low frequencies to cause phase issues. But you have to know where the fundamental frequency is and roll up until you can hear that all of a sudden your body comes back. I'm not going to do a demonstration on that, but you can also just look it up on YouTube. You can find plenty of videos of folks demonstrating what happens when you try to blend in two signals that aren't EQ'd properly and they phase cancel each other out. So the great thing is you found this pretty extreme compression setting. Now we have an individual fader to control the level of that setting, right? So we can solo the drum bus, and then we can blend it into taste. Our kick and our snare almost disappear without it. Granted, this is nowhere near a completely mixed drum kit, but you get what I'm saying here. Parallel compression, parallel saturation, parallel processing on the drums is hugely important for getting the sound that you're probably going for. Another common technique is to send your toms. We don't have individually mic'd toms for this record, But if you did, you could send them all to a Toms bus. VCA bus compressors work really well on Toms. 1176s also sound really good on Toms. So this is a really useful technique. I would highly recommend you start experimenting with buses sooner than later. Okay, I gotta wrap this up because the sun's going down and I've only got natural light. Tip number 5, or really reason number 5, why you might want to reach for a compressor. The last reason that I would commonly reach for a compressor is for controlling the dynamics of an inconsistent drummer or an inconsistent drum performance. This is similar. They're all very similar because compressors do a thing and you can use that thing to do multiple things, right? But all of these reasons why you would use a compressor are going to be inherently linked with each other. This is similar to the idea of manipulating transients with a compressor. However, even if you have an incredibly consistent drummer, you're still probably gonna have to do some transient enhancement with compression or a transient shaper. So manipulating transients and controlling the dynamics of an inconsistent drummer are not exactly the same thing, and that's why I have them as 2 separate reasons in this list. So let's say that you have a wildly inconsistent drum performance, or even a moderately inconsistent drum performance. One moment they're hitting the snare very quietly, the next time they're trying to punch a hole in it, or one moment they're lightly tapping the kick and releasing the beater so the drum has this nice long decay but no attack, and then the next second they're smacking down on the kick and not releasing the beater so it's all smack and no decay. It's up to you as the engineer to figure out how much dynamic range you want to preserve and how to do it in a way that sounds good and makes the artist happy. But compression will most likely be one of the tools that you reach for to address these issues. It's also very common to simply reach for samples. There are many ways of utilizing samples to enhance a drum sound that do not include completely replacing with drum samples either, and I'll make a video about how to do so using Logic Pro X in the near future. If you're in a situation where you need better control of the dynamics of individual elements of a drum performance, I would typically reach for the same compressors as for tip number 3, depending on the source material. So that would be an 1176, for example, or the Ssl E or G channel dynamic section, right? Or any sort of digital compressor. I mean, they're all digital, they're in a computer, but I think you know what I'm saying. Any sort of digital compressor that may come with your DAW, or the C1 or the R-Comp by Waves are good examples as well. And sometimes this isn't what I would first reach for, but it is an option. Sometimes it sounds really good on snare drum, is an LA2A. Now, the thing about controlling the dynamics of an inconsistent drummer is that everything that we have done so far, everything from our drum bus to compressing the room to parallel bus compression to individual manipulations of the transient, everything that we've covered is going to help even out the performance of a drummer. And that's why if you don't need to go in surgically, sometimes an LA2A does sound really great on a snare drum. There could also be more options for compressors out there, but these are just the ones that come to mind for me. Once again, just keep in mind as you're compressing for this particular purpose, slow attack means more transient, quick attack means less transient. And with the release time, you could do auto release. Many compressors do have auto release functions that typically sound pretty decent. But if you want more control with the release, you really just have to listen. To be completely honest, I left this reason for last because this is my least favorite time to reach for a compressor. As I said, I prefer top-down methods and broad strokes across the board. Sometimes it is necessary to dig deep on a particular element, and I do compress individual elements when necessary. But if I end up with a wildly inconsistent drum performance, I would honestly rather utilize samples in subtle ways than apply very heavy-handed compression on a single element. I actually find that creative use of samples can preserve the feel of a drummer even better than heavy-handed compression if used correctly. I think this is contrary to common belief. There's definitely a stigma around using samples to support live drums, and I used to feel this way too until I got more involved in record production. And believe me, drums like Def Leppard or Paramore are not my taste. Don't get me wrong, I got a soft spot for both of those bands, but a drum kit, a natural drum kit, does not sound like the drums on Pour Some Sugar on Me, nor Hallelujah. These sounds heavily feature the use of samples, But there are many ways to utilize samples that are not so extreme that preserve the feeling and variation of the original drum performance. Some of my favorite examples of drum sounds that utilize none or minimal sample use include Nirvana's In Utero, Rage Against the Machine's first and second releases, any album by System of a Down, and any album by the White Stripes. At any rate, I find that the previous 4 methods of compression with creative use of samples yield awesome drum sounds that are commercially competitive, but are still natural and full of feeling. Again, a deep dive on samples in Logic Pro X will be coming in the near future. Alright, that about wraps it up for this week's video. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Once again, to quickly recap, those were 5 common reasons that I thought of why you might want to reach for a compressor to compress your drums. Please also feel free to share any of your favorite plugins that I missed that I didn't call out, or any of your favorite techniques for compressing drums that didn't make it onto my list of 5 common reasons why. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in to this week's video. I really appreciate you taking the time and energy to view my content each week. If you haven't already, please leave a like down below and subscribe and ring the bell. I do upload each week, and you don't want to miss the premieres where you have a chance to engage with myself and others in the live chat. If you would like to support the channel, please browse the links below. If you want to pick up your own Baby Arugula merch, this is one of the designs currently available, and you can find my merch hub in the description below. Also, don't forget to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at babyarugula_prod production. I also have curated Spotify playlists and links to all the artists that I've had the pleasure of getting to work with down below. Once again, thank you so much. I hope you had a great time, and I'll see you next week. Bye.